The rain did not merely fall in Blackwood, it seemed to mourn. Beneath the charcoal canopy of a November sky, the mourners stood like statues of grief, their black umbrellas swaying in unison, a field of mourning obsidian. At the center lay the casket of Nancy Guthrie, a woman whose life had been a masterpiece of quiet, suffocating secrets. But as the minister began the final benediction, the atmosphere fractured. A sharp, rhythmic metallic tapping erupted from within the mahogany box, a sound that silenced the wind, froze the priest's breath, and sent a jolt of primal terror through the gathered crowd. It was not the hollow rattle of shifting earth or the groan of wood under pressure. It was deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly human. As the lid groaned, splintering under an internal force that defied the laws of death, a singular question hung suspended in the freezing air. Could the silence of a lifetime be broken by a heartbeat from the grave, or was this the final, cruel orchestration of a woman who refused to let the truth be buried with her? The Guthrie estate did not house a family, it curated a performance. Within the walls of the ancestral home, the air was perpetually stale, thick with the scent of beeswax, old parchment, and the unspoken mandates of 3 generations. For young Nancy Guthrie, the house was a labyrinth of velvet-lined silence, where every floorboard groan was hushed and every stray emotion was swiftly archived. Her childhood was not a progression of play, but a series of rehearsals for a life that was never truly hers to possess. Nancy's parents moved through the rooms like ghosts in a mausoleum, their voices rarely rising above a measured, rhythmic cadence. She learned early that transparency was dangerous, a fracture in the porcelain veneer of the Guthrie name. She watched her mother, a woman who existed in the periphery of her own life, constantly smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt, her gaze always fixed on some point just beyond the window. The psychological weight of these expectations acted upon Nancy like a slow, crushing pressure. She became a master of repression, a child who understood that to be loved was to be useful, and to be useful was to be invisible. The origin of her internal wound, the fissure that would eventually become a canyon, occurred on a Tuesday, the day her father unilaterally ended her friendship with the only person who had ever looked at her with genuine, unburdened curiosity. It was a cold, clinical severance. There was no shouting, only the quiet closing of a heavy oak door and the subsequent disappearance of the girl who had once made Nancy feel seen. In that moment, the betrayal was absolute. She realized that the people tasked with protecting her were, in reality, the architects of her most profound isolation. They taught her that intimacy was a liability and that truth was a currency that could bankrupt those who dared to spend it. Years later, the house felt even smaller, the silence more predatory. Nancy, now an adolescent trapped in the role of the dutiful heir, sought sanctuary in the attic, the only space that defied the rigid, polished order of the floors below. It was a place of dust-moted sunlight and forgotten relics, where the reality of her lineage lay in untidy piles. Among them, she found a cedar chest, its lock long surrendered to rust. Inside were bundles of letters, the ink faded, the paper brittle and yellowed. They were written by her mother, addressed to a name Nancy had never heard, detailing a life of desperate, clandestine yearning that mirrored her own suppressed existence. As Nancy reached the final page of the deepest bundle, her breath hitched. The concluding letter was not a confession of love, but a legalistic, terrifying deposition. There, at the bottom of the page, written in her mother's elegant, trembling script, was her own name, Nancy. It was the terminal point of a confession that suggested their lives were not merely similar, but were inextricably bound by a singular, dark, and long-standing pact. The transformation of Nancy Guthrie into a public icon was not merely a career trajectory. It was a transmutation of the self into a monument. By her 30s, she existed in a rarefied atmosphere of blinding flashbulbs and whispered reverence. To the world, Nancy was the archetype of grace, the philanthropist who navigated tragedies with the stoic poise of a saint. Yet, in the silent, pressurized vacuum of her private life, that grace felt more like rigor mortis. She resided in a penthouse that felt less like a home and more like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of her own image. The psychological toll of such a performative existence began to manifest as a peculiar, internal erosion. Every gala, every televised address, and every meticulously crafted interview was a hollow ritual, a performance for an audience that demanded perfection in exchange for their adoration. Nancy became a prisoner of her own reputation, trapped within a gilded cage constructed of expectations and favorable press clippings. She moved through her days with a terrifying, robotic precision, yet behind the composed mask, her psyche was fracturing. She experienced quiet, existential breakdowns during the rare intervals of solitude, moments where the silence of her apartment amplified the roar of her own mounting dread. She developed an obsessive, almost ritualistic need to curate her environment. Every book on the mahogany shelf, every drape in the master suite, and every item of clothing had to be placed with exactness, as if the physical order of her world could counteract the chaos unfolding within her mind. She feared that if a single element were misplaced, the structural integrity of her persona would finally collapse, revealing the hollow, frightened woman who had never truly learned how to exist outside the context of others' perceptions. The rot beneath the surface deepened when the letters began to arrive. They were not merely pieces of correspondence. They were mirrors held up to the darkest corners of her memory. They contained the exact, haunting text of the attic letters, those forbidden documents that had once suggested a dark, inherited pact. The anonymous sender did not demand money or threaten exposure in the traditional sense. They simply provided reminders, forcing Nancy to relive the moments she had spent a lifetime burying. The sender knew the true price of her legacy, that it was built upon a foundation of blood and inherited silence. The atmosphere in her home shifted from sanctuary to surveillance. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the city skyline against her walls, became a potential threat. Her nights were spent in a state of hypervigilance, pacing the perimeter of her life as if trying to catch a ghost in the act of erasing her. The turning point, the moment the abstract fear crystallized into an inescapable reality, came on a Tuesday, the anniversary of her father's passing. Nancy returned to her penthouse, the air inside unusually frigid, smelling faintly of the same attic dust that had clung to the old cedar chest. As she stepped into her master suite, the dim glow of the city lights revealed the horror waiting for her. Her vanity mirror, a massive, antique piece that had been the focal point of her morning rituals, had been reduced to a web of jagged, shimmering glass. The fractures were not random. They were deliberate, carved into a complex, angular pattern that perfectly mimicked the singular, distinctive signature that graced the bottom of the letters she had been receiving. She stood frozen, the jagged reflection of her own terrified eyes splintered across a dozen shards, realizing that her watcher was no longer merely observing her life. They were actively dismantling it. The fall of Nancy Guthrie did not arrive with the thunder of a collapsing empire. It arrived as a slow, insidious leak, a single, unauthorized audio recording from a private gala, capturing a voice that was not the polished, philanthropic instrument the public adored, but a sharp, serrated blade of vitriol and exhaustion. The recording, which circulated through the digital ether with the speed of a plague, laid bare the hollow mechanics of her charity and the calculated cruelty she employed to maintain her image. Overnight, the veneer of the saint was stripped away, leaving only the wreckage of a woman who had never truly lived. This was the descent into the void, a period defined by the frantic, peeling back of her own protective layers. As the media scrutiny intensified, turning her life into a carnival of moral judgment, Nancy retreated into the mausoleum of her estate. She became a prisoner of a different kind, one governed by the rhythmic, agonizing pulse of insomnia. In the dead hours of the night, when the city lights cast elongated, skeletal shadows across her floors, the memories she had spent decades suppressing began to bleed into the present. Her psychological state became a fractured mosaic. The ghosts of her past, once relegated to the corners of her mind, now walked the hallways of her home. She saw the younger version of herself in every reflective surface, a girl who had been traded like a piece of property in a grand, generational game. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing, suffocating blanket that smelled of damp attics and betrayal. She realized that every noble deed, every public act of grace, had been a desperate attempt to purchase a forgiveness she did not believe she deserved. In a state of delirium, Nancy turned her resources toward a final, futile act of reconciliation. She obsessively traced the provenance of the letters that continued to plague her, convinced that they were the work of a phantom antagonist. Yet, as she combed through the archives of her own family history, the lines between memory and reality blurred into a singular, terrifying realization. The person haunting her, the unseen hand that had shattered her mirror and dismantled her life, was not an enemy. It was a projection, a manifestation of the younger, untainted version of herself, an iteration of Nancy who had never learned how to lie. The haunting was not an assault from the outside, but a desperate, final intervention from within. The silence of the house grew heavy, pulsing with the gravity of her impending dissolution. She found herself in her study, surrounded by the debris of her failed existence, the scent of dust once again filling her lungs. The air grew impossibly cold, and the walls seemed to exhale, closing in on the woman who had traded her soul for a name. Nancy was discovered at dawn, sprawled across her mahogany desk, unconscious and cold to the touch. Her fingers were locked in a death grip around the brittle, yellowed attic letters. Beside her lay an open leather journal, the final page filled with frantic, jagged scrawls that trailed off into nothingness. The last entry did not contain a confession, but a name, the name of the person who would eventually bring her home, a name that chilled the investigators to their core. The funeral of Nancy Guthrie was not a cessation of existence. It was the final, grand installation of a lifelong art project. As the rain descended upon Blackwood like a curtain of liquid grief, the attendees gathered, a sea of black silk and polished pretension. They were the architects of her public image, the beneficiaries of her charity, and the silent enablers of her decline. They stood in the damp, manicured grass, dabbing eyes that were dry and whispering condolences that sounded like practiced lines from a script. They did not know that they were not mourners at a burial, but spectators at an execution, and the victim had already escaped the scaffold. Nancy's death was the ultimate psychological gambit, a masterstroke of design that required the total annihilation of her persona to achieve its singular, brutal purpose. She had spent the final weeks of her seclusion not in mourning or despair, but in cold, calculating preparation. She understood that in a world governed by the spectacle, the only way to demand true attention was to offer a ghost. She had orchestrated every detail, from the selection of the mahogany casket to the precise calibration of the mechanical device she had hidden beneath the velvet lining. She found a strange, intoxicating purpose in the act of her own erasure. Her legacy would not be the hollow prestige she had cultivated for decades, but the seismic shockwave she would leave behind in her absence. The atmosphere in the cemetery thickened as the minister began his recitation. The mourners were trapped in their own comfort, unaware that the ground beneath them was no longer stable. They were performing the familiar, comforting rituals of grief, yet they were entirely oblivious to the fact that they were being evaluated by the woman they thought they had put away. Nancy, watching from a hidden vantage point nearby, felt a profound, chilling detachment. She realized that she had finally transcended the need for their validation. Her life had been a cage, but her death would be the key that unlocked the truth for anyone brave enough to witness the wreckage. As the minister reached the final benediction, the air seemed to coil, vibrating with a mechanical tension that defied the stillness of the afternoon. Then came the sound, a rhythmic, sharp, metallic tapping that erupted from within the casket. It was the sound of a countdown reaching zero. The gathered crowd froze, the umbrellas slipping from trembling hands. The lid did not merely budge, it splintered, pushed from beneath by a force that felt both inevitable and monstrous. The wood groaned, a final, screeching protest against the violence of the truth being unleashed. The mourners recoiled, their faces shifting from performative sorrow to visceral, paralyzing shock. They had come to bury a memory, only to be confronted by the terrifying vitality of a secret that refused to stay under the soil. The lid fell away with a hollow thud, landing in the mud. The camera, moving with the precision of a predator, closed the distance, panning down toward the depths of the casket. The audience expected to see the pale, still face of the woman they had destroyed. Instead, The frame caught the glint of something sharp and unforgiving. There was no body. There was only an immense, custom-fitted mirror, perfectly angled to reflect the distorted, terrified faces of the mourners back at themselves. Below the reflection, resting on the velvet, lay a single, fresh, handwritten letter. Its ink was bold, defiant, and addressed to every person standing in that graveyard. It was the final, inescapable performance, an indictment of their complicity, written in the hand of a woman who had finally learned that the only way to survive the world was to burn it down from the inside. The cycle of the Guthrie silence was broken, replaced by the deafening, eternal echo of the truth.